All right, dudes. Welcome back to Mix Wednesday number 4. We're going to go over some bus processing. Right now I've got a project by Ryan, the same project we've been using this whole time. And we're going to go ahead and take a listen to it with all the bus processing that Ryan put on here. But then I think we're going to dive in a couple other things too. So let's check it out. So here's the dry track without the bus processing on it. Stop it, and we'll apply all the bus processing.
I was hanging out with some friends of mine down in Hollywood, just wasting time. I knew right then nobody could get me down, 'cause I was taking myself out on the town.
So we're going to add all the effects that Ryan put on here. We've got the BX Solo, which is a little stereo spreader. We've got the EQ7, and then we've got the Maxim. So let's take a listen to that now.
I was hanging out with some friends of mine down in Hollywood, just wasting time. I knew right then nobody could get me down, 'cause I was taking myself out on the town. We're gonna have a good time.
All right, Ryan, you want to show us a little bit about what you were doing in these tracks?
Sure. So BX Solo is pretty much always on my master. If not BX Solo, it'll be one of the other Brainworks plugins, just to get a little bit of MS widening. I use BX Solo for this because it's a free plugin that all of you can get, and it's functionally similar. So what it's doing is it's kind of reverse MSing a mix. So it's splitting it out into mid and side, and then the stereo width knob there on the right is controlling the blend ratio between mid and side that is coming back out, what we're hearing. So if you roll that all the way to the left, you go back to 0, it goes to just full mono, just mid. You bump it all the way up to like 200% or whatever it actually goes all the way up to, 400%. It's 4 times the amount of stereo information is being presented to you. Things sound really wacky and unnatural when you go that high.
Yep.
The only limitations of using BX Solo here is that the percentages it lets you set it to are kind of limited. So I think you can do 100, you can do 150, you can do maybe 200, et cetera, et cetera. Realistically, I never really need more than 125. But if you put it on reasonably early in the mix, you can mix into it, and you have a very good idea of what it's going to do level-wise to the stuff on your sides. If you toss this on all the way at the end of a mix, it's going to completely mess with your balance, because the stuff you have panned out is going to change in volume. So this is one of those things you got to put on pretty early. I mean, again, this session we're using right now is actually just a mix prep session. It's not actually a final mix. It's nowhere near it, but we start putting these things on early, or I start putting these things on early, so that I can mix into them and already know what they're going to do, rather than just toss them on at the end and have them hopefully get me to where I need to go.
Right.
The next one I've got is the EQ here. On the EQ, just bumping a little bit of brightness. Rather than brightening up 30 different tracks separately, I already know that the entire mix is a tiny bit duller than I want it to be, so I bumped a little bit of that. And same with the low mid-range / lows, that 125, 130-ish region seemed a little weak overall, and it wasn't just a single element that seemed weak, it was the whole mix, so it needed a touch more of it. The point of note here is that I'm making these changes while going back and forth between reference mixes. So I'm listening to a finished mastered track and taking a listen to it and seeing what it sounds like compared to what I've got. And if it sounds a lot brighter, if it sounds a lot duller, whatever it may be, I'm trying to get tonally closer to that. The Maxim is on there just so that I can get a little closer in relative level to a professional mastered track. Because realistically, in the end, this track is going to get limited by somebody, if not me. So I might as well put it on there and build the mix with some idea of what it's doing already. If I get to a point that I feel like my mix is a little out of control and the compressor might be holding it back together, I will bypass that limiter, and my mix should still sound very good. It should still sound well balanced and well put together. But then I'll toss that back on just so I can put it up against a reference mix and not have to worry about it.
Cool. That's pretty cool.
These 3 aren't necessarily my plugins of choice, but these are the 3 that everybody has access to right now that is free.
Right. All right. Well, let's take a listen to this track without the with just the BX solo on it real quick, and then I'll slowly add in the EQ. Well, start without the BX solo, and I'll slowly add in all three, so you can kind of get an understanding of what Ryan's doing here. So let's take a listen.
I was hanging out with some friends of mine down in Hollywood, just wasting time. I knew right then nobody could get me down, 'cause I was taking myself out on the town. We're gonna have a good time. We're gonna have a good time. I didn't think it could get much better than this. Then Charlie said, I know a place.
Cool. So that's kind of what Ryan's doing in this, but
Well,
also,
real quick, you'll see there, if you look at the meter, the correlation's good, balance is reasonably even, but also your RMS, you're at, I think it was somewhere between -12 and -14. Realistically, that's actually already a commercially releasable level. It's not commercially releasable in the pop world, because pop gets a little insane. You can hit -6 or whatnot. But rock world, for the most part, sits around -9. So we're already at a reasonable level. And we haven't even gotten to starting this mix, actually. We're basically raw tracks right now still.
Yep.
Ryan, so, do you ever throw any compression in early on in the mix on your master bus?
I do.
I mean,
usually,
I know the limiter is compression, but
right. Usually I'll be about 80% of the way through my mix, like where my tones are getting to where I want them to be, and I'm kind of starting to add in, effects and maybe just touching on automation. At this point, I know I've already got a pretty good static mix. Then I toss on the master bus comp, and usually I use the API 2500, or I'll use one of my hardware compressors, because I can do that. I'll toss on the dangerous comp, and it'll only be hitting maybe 1.5 decibels of compression, just barely tickling it. But the tonality of that compressor is just very attractive. It does a really good thing to the top end. It doesn't necessarily change your levels in your blend, but it might add a kind of harmonic richness to whatever's going on. And that's kind of what you want out of a master bus compressor. You don't want it to change your blend. You don't really want it to change your EQ per se. You just want it to add some excitement. So, yeah.
Oh no, so the widening, the BX solo, the little bit of EQ and the limiter, do you put that on earlier in your mix?
I put the BX solo on really early, because it changes your balance a lot. The EQ, I'll put it on once I kind of figure out tonally where everything is. If everything is deficient in a certain way, I'll put it on, because it's easier to use one EQ than 30. If it happens to only be the bass that's wonky at 150, I'll pull it out of the bass rather than pulling it out of the whole mix. But sometimes, if everything's tracked in one place by one guy, it may have a specific tonality to the entire tracking, and it could be helpful to deal with it on the master.
Okay.
In terms of placement of the bus compressor, BX solo is always the first thing on my master, or any of the other Brainworks that do the similar thing. But after that, the order of EQ compressor might switch. Sometimes the EQ will be before the compressor, sometimes it'll be after. Usually it's after, because it's about final tonality. So I want it to be close to a reference, and I don't want my compressor to kind of undo what I've got going on. And then obviously last, you've got a limiter / dither and all that.
Killer.
Well, actually last with a meter, but
yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Kenny, what's your approach in this kind of thing? I know you have a slightly different workflow than Ryan. I'd love to hear what you kind of start with, what you work with, and then how you kind of end your mix. Ryan seems to have these plugins that he throws on at the very beginning, and he mixes into them. Do you have a similar paradigm that you use, that you work within, or is it kind of a similar type of paradigm that you're working in? So I'd love to hear what you got to say about this kind of thing.
Yeah, I like to use a widener as well. I typically put that in fairly early, like Ryan does. And after that, I leave it alone until, like Ryan was saying, we get our basic sounds down. So whatever you want to call it, 75, 80% through your mix. Before you're hitting that point in your mix where you're doing stuff like automation and general balance and dynamics.
Killer.
So, and then one thing that I do sometimes is I take something just like a compressor for its tonal qualities, like the VBC, the Slate VBC. I'll just leave that on, but not compressing at all. Because if you turn that on and off, it's definitely doing some interesting stuff. So maybe I'll just use that I'll throw it on, keep that going as a guideline almost for my ear, and then I'll plan on using that as my bus compression.
That's cool.
In all different sorts of ways.
So do you typically use the gray, the red, or the other one they got in here, the actual Fairchild model?
I keep them all on. Sometimes I turn the red off, and
Gotcha.
I just have it run through for the tonal qualities.
And you kind of have some pretty like maybe not too drastic of a setting, so it doesn't like actually like it just kind of get the harmonic kind of feel of the plugin rather than just like actually using it to. I guess you are using it to get that too. Yeah, you're just kind of like throwing it on there to mix into it, get an idea of what it's sounding like.
Yeah, it gives. I think. I mean, it's probably premature for many situations, but it gives me a good feel of the type of character that I'll be working with when I do start twiddling with my master processing.
Yeah. You got it on there with literally no compression, so the thresholds are wide open, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Gotcha. So that's the important thing to look at. If you guys are watching this right now, we're actually, Kenny's mixing into a compressor, but he's got the thresholds wide open. So he's just adding these for their harmonic value, not really anything of use yet. Ryan, why don't do you do that, Ryan, or is that just something you don't do?
I don't, but then again, my master bus compressor, like, so as I was saying, I mean, for the most part, I'm using a hardware master bus compressor.
Right.
And I don't really let it hit more than the decibel and a half.
Oh, wow.
So until I get to the point where it's actually starting to compress, the tonality is already there because I've probably already inserted it as well. So it's a similar process. It's just that I don't end up physically, changing the threshold settings. I just, as my mix progresses, the mix overall is getting a bit louder. As you're getting through your dynamics of controlling your vocal, your bass, your drums, and all that, you are realistically just kind of generally making things a little more present, a little bit louder. So as the mix progresses, it actually just starts to hit that threshold. So I don't actually have to physically change it. It's just sitting there. And as I'm moving forward, it's starting to start compressing.
I like that. And then I assume every, 20 minutes or even less than that, you're engaging and disengaging that compressor to see what it's doing.
Just to make sure it's doing something that's actually helping me out, as opposed to it's doing something that's saving my ass because my mix is such a mess that it's putting back together. That's a pretty big thing, actually. You got to make sure that your mix bus compressor is not what's pulling your mix together, because if it is, then your mix is bad and it happens to be making it passable. Your mix can otherwise be good and having it make your mix even better.
Right.
So,
other than that,
Crazy.
I think I have a pretty similar approach to Ryan. But there are definitely some things I do that Ryan and a few other people have taught me to check for issues in my mix. And one of the things I do is I keep a one-band EQ at the end of my chain. Well, before the meter.
I forgot about that. I do that too.
Yeah.
I didn't put it in this session. My bad. Whoops.
So what this will do is I go for high pass filter first, and I roll it off slowly. And I just let it play, and I see if there's anything that sounds wacky in any area. I do the same thing with low pass. If anything sounds wacky, it gives me a lot of information to, if there's, say, something in the guitars in the low mids that's kind of not meshing well with what the bass is doing, I can
Gotcha.
find that and address that.
Very cool.
Basically, it's a way to kind of eliminate a little bit of the your room and your monitors factor from what you're listening to,
Right.
because it allows you to focus on very specific frequency ranges. So as Kenny was saying, if you toss it on high pass, leave it on 20 hertz, you hit play in your mix, as you start riding it up in frequency, your low end should start disappearing, but you should be able to hear your entire mix all the way up until 5K. Once you're at 5K, yeah, it's going to be a bright sounding mix, but you should still hear the kick, you should still hear the bass, you should still hear the snare. And as you move up, no single element should suddenly start sticking out. Because if it does, that means the frequencies that were below it were hiding it, were masking it and putting it to a level where it made sense.
Amazing.
And now if you do it the other way and do it as a low pass and set it to 20K and start sliding it downwards, it should do the same thing. You should be able to hear your entire mix all the way down to maybe 100. Like when you're at 100, you should still hear your vocal and all those things. And it really does work. It allows you to really focus on problem frequencies. For me, it's often something like a snare drum, because I like a ton of low mid in the snare drum because it just really hits you in the chest.
Yeah, totally.
Sometimes I overdo it accidentally, and when I take my low pass and I start moving it down, all of a sudden I get to 400, and I notice that the snare is just really in your face and just too loud, and it's masking everything. At that point, I realized that my 250 to 300 on my snare was probably too much, way too much, and I just didn't notice because there was so much other stuff going on around it that kind of masked that I had just bumped it like that.
Wow. It's pretty nifty trick there, Ryan and Kenny. Awesome. So you'd say that this is kind of what you're looking at. You've got your EQ, you've got your limiter at the end of the chain. Maybe you'll throw a compressor in there, but then you'll definitely always have your meter at the end, and then your EQ for this kind of sweeping and referencing every single frequency or isolating. Basically, you're checking. It's like you're checking all frequencies just by having a high pass or a low pass in there, just making sure that your mix comes across pretty clearly. It's kind of the same concept as mixing. You were talking about at one point. We were talking at one point about how mixing at low volumes can really reveal some things about your mix. So if you're like at a really if you're at a really low volume, you should be able to still basically hear everything inside of your mix, and it shouldn't as you increase the actual gain on the mix, it'll sound better. So that's pretty cool.
Did you guys want to talk about where to leave your? Well, you said -9 RMS is a typical place you want to be with a.
That's a typical place commercially.
Right. Did you guys want to talk about where you want it to be and how you want it to be before you send it off to a mastering engineer?
Yeah, so I mean, it's all dependent on the mix. It's dependent on the genre. If you're talking some, big pop stuff, your mix is going to be pretty heavily compressed. It's not going to be super dynamic. And this is before it goes to mastering, before it ever hits a limiter. So you could be in a very particular place. If you're doing something jazzy, it's going to be a lot lower. If you're doing some rock and roll, it's going to be in a different place. Generally, I aim for -14 RMS and to just not be clipping. And when I say clipping, I mean no intersample peaks either. So I generally go for, a dB and a half of headroom. Like my peaks end there. I realize that's a little bit more extreme than most people say. Most people say leave 3 dB for your mastering engineer, but every mastering engineer I've ever known doesn't care if there's 3 dB because they're just going to turn it up or they're going to turn it down. All they care about is that it doesn't clip anywhere in it, and they care that your master bus compression is not something that's going to limit them from their job.
Right.
And that's more important than like the actual physical level of what comes out to them. I mean, I could take my mix and bump it down 10 dB and send it to them. It's not going to change anything for them. They're just going to bump it back up 10 dB.
Right.
How about yourself? Where are you at in terms of level before you send it out?
Me?
Yep.
that sounds like about where I want to be. I think a lot of people wonder whether to leave compression and EQ on your master fader before sending it out. And I think that's why with that stuff, I try to keep it very, very minimal. And with keeping in mind, the main idea is I want this to sound like the way the client is going to play it in their car or on their stereo. I want it to sound like a commercial mix.
Right. I'm on the same page with you there. I don't want to send a mix that I don't think is perfect to mastering. I don't want my mix to come back from mastering sounding completely different from what I sent. I want them to take care of the translation between my system and other speaker systems, and I want them to take care of things like that. I want them to take care of making the entire record very cohesive, because I know on some records I've got very mellow tracks, and then I've got big rock and roll tracks, and I need them all to work together.
Yep.
But I'm never going to send a mastering guy a track that I don't think sounds like what I want the record to sound like, if you know what I mean.
Right.
Another point of note is when I send my references to the band, when I go, this is mix version 1, mix version 2, mix version 3, and I send it to the band, I send it to them with a pseudo mastering on it. And this is because I want them to be able to, and they're going to, just toss it on their iPod and play it next to their favorite band. And if you send them a track that is, nowhere near mastered, and your master EQ needs to be tweaked a bunch, or if you have the excuse of, well, mastering is going to fix that, then they're going to be much less excited about your mix. I mean, they might believe you, and that may be true, but you could get your client so much more excited if you just give them something that they can play right next to a commercial release and just be super stoked on. Like, this is just as good as my favorite band's record.
Right.
Yeah, don't ever think that because it's going to be mastered, you can half-ass anything. Try to make it as good as you can make it sound, the way you want it to sound, the way it should sound.
Basically, the idea that mastering fixes anything is a cop-out. That's how I see it. I see it as a cop-out. If you can't do it and get your mix to that point, then it's kind of comical. That being said, if you remind me later, I will post 2 links to a song on here. One of them is my reference master that I sent to the band. One is the final version that came back from mastering. And it's from a very legit mastering studio that everybody has and owns records from.
Wow.
Just so you can hear the two and hear what they sound like.
Well, we can definitely do that.
Cool.
Great, guys. Well, that's a lot of information right there. Dang. Hopefully you guys over there on the other side of Mix Wednesday are following along. But yeah, we're going to be posting this project. We'll be posting it with all the effects that I have in here. For the master stuff, I'll probably bypass Kenny's, or actually, no, I'm going to leave Kenny's on there. I'm going to bypass all of Ryan's stuff. And that's what I'm going to do, mostly because I love the Slate digital stuff. But yeah, so do you guys have any more stuff you wanted to talk about here? Or you think it's a good amount of information for these guys?
It's a good amount of information, and yeah, we'll be good. We'll have a discussion about this.
Yeah.
Cool, guys. Alrighty. Well, thanks for watching this video. This is Dan Gonzalez, Ryan John, and Kenny Goshgarian, and we'll see you next week on Mix Wednesday.